Thanks, Nathaniel. You stole part of my lecture on Kierkegaard, though. And thank you so much for having me here, and thanks to Nick for arranging it and everything. I'm very, very appreciative. But since this lecture is about, to some extent, about honesty, I've also got to be honest with you and tell you I have a little bit of a fear of public speaking. I get a little freaked out about public speaking. And then when I looked this week and saw some of the other people you had here, not particularly shy people like Jesse Ventura, Rachel Maddow. It's people that can just get up there and talk and no self-conscious while I about croaked. And then one night I turned on the TV set and the Johnny Cash movie Walk the Line is on. And the scene I saw, Johnny's up there on stage, falls down from drinking, and I said, oh, my wife Susan, I said to her, that's going to be me. You know, so I'm a little, but my wonderful students at St. Olaf, and we have an alumni here, Rob, and they were very sweet this week. They came up and they told me, hey, Doc, you'll be just fine. Just talk slowly, because I'm from New Jersey and Italian, and breathe. Don't forget to breathe, they said. Okay. But I was blessed with a little more advice. As Nathaniel noticed, I'm a boxing trainer and a boxing writer, and a television commentator called me up, one who's suffering from cancer, and was very kind to take the time to call me up to offer some advice. And he said, Gordon, just go with your strengths and you'll be fine. And so today you're going to get a little philosophy class, lunchtime philosophy class, if that's okay, all right? So it's going to be, and a little close reading. So I have I thought I had 45 minutes, but it looks like I only have 30. So we're going to get at least one text up there that we're going to need to study carefully. Part of my method in teaching is close readings. And so you got to stick with me with one text from Kierkegaard. But the topic I'm going to talk about is our approach to moral education in America, in which my discipline of philosophy has been very much involved in. And I want to argue that ethics education needs to engage a little more psychology. So that's one of the main points. But let me begin with a few remarks about how philosophy came down from Plato's heaven into the sphere of applied ethics and ethics education. It all began in the 60s when, as a result of a number of terrible medical research blunders, this man by the name of Henry Beecher wrote a famous article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1966, documenting all these terrible cases of abuses. And that was the beginning of biomedical ethics, when you had philosophers coming into professional fields and kind of becoming the conscious of those fields. And then later on in the 80s, you had the Millikan scandals on Wall Street, and so philosophers rushed into Wall Street, and you had this whole beginning of business ethics, right? Business ethics. So this trend, this trend of philosophers getting involved in professional fields and kind of operating as the conscience of that field. Got it? And I don't know how it's worked in the business ethics. It's a $2 billion a year industry, and doesn't seem like we're having any fewer scandals these days. So I mean, I don't know what the bottom line there is on how philosophers affect ethics. But over the last few decades, there's been a sense of moral crisis in America and a call for mandatory ethics classes in high schools and colleges. And I teach one of those classes. And for the most part, what you do in those classes, you present students with theories, utilitarian, deontological, virtue ethics, that kind of thing. And then certain puzzles. For example, utilitarianism says that we ought to do that which does the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So you might say, well, okay, suppose you have a terrorist who's a low pain threshold, and if you torture him or her, you can save 40,000 lives. Should you do it? So we have to go between theories, case studies, that kind of thing. And these exercises are all well and good and useful for developing skills and analysis and for public discussion. But our ethics education often glides over a distinction that Aristotle made between intellectual and moral virtue, intellectual excellence and moral excellence, or character, between being able to talk and reason about ethics and actually having the moral mettle to abide by that reasoning. Or again, between knowing the right thing to do and actually doing it. Contrary to the views of Max Weber, who maintained that universities ought to be about the task of disseminating knowledge, not about edification, Many colleges have gotten into the business of trying to improve morality and even character building. St. Olaf is very much involved with this, and I think it's very important. This being the case, I think that as educators, we should provide more opportunities for thinking about what gets in the way of doing the right thing. What are the impediments to being moral? Right? There's not a lot of attention paid to that. So a more realistic moral psychology. What gets in our way? The concern about character as opposed to knowledge really came home when Bernie Madoff made off with all the money. The fact that Madoff got the name Madoff, God's got to be playing tricks. I mean, it's just something there. I mean, it's, again, through a glass darkly or something. But with that scandal, everyone seemed to recognize that greed, not a lack of knowledge or skills of analysis, was the more fundamental problem. That greed was the more fundamental problem. The worry seems to have blown over a bit, but one of my favorite lessons on that subject came from a Cherokee tale in which a grandfather says to his grandson, life is a battle between two wolves within us. Life is a battle between two wolves within us. One is greed and arrogance, and the other is generosity and compassion. Greed and arrogance and generosity and compassion. And the little kid asks, well, which wolf wins, Grandpa? And Grandpa says, the wolf you feed. The wolf you feed. And I suspect that we've been teaching our children to feed the wolf of boundless appetite in America. We haven't been, every culture has its own table of virtues, of qualities that count for excellence of character. So, like, for example, in my ethics classes, I'll ask students, when we were studying Aristotle, eudaimonia, what are the characteristics that you think are the most important for moral virtue? And I always get creativity, energy, courage sometimes, tolerance, sense of humor is really big, right? So if you just think of what is character composed of, but I've never, ever gotten self-control, self-restraint, sophrosyne. It's the key to virtues with the Greeks. We don't care a damn about it, right? If you look at television, the movies, there's just, it's never, self-control needs, self-discipline needs a new PR person because it's just not something we stress. It's not something we stress. All the people we lionize have appetites like lions, right? So I think it would really help to to emphasize some of the beauty of self-restraint and self-control, and it's important. But as for the pandemic of greed, maybe we don't experience our greed as greed. Maybe we tell ourselves, I'm just taking care of my family, getting what is mine. After all, I deserve $30 million for the company I just drove down the drain. I don't know. Which brings me to the issue of self-deception or pulling the wool over our own eyes. I think that most of the wrongs that we commit are oiled by self-deception. I think it's very unusual for someone to say, I think X is wrong, but I'm going to do X anyhow. Right? We come up with some line. Right? I mean, remember when I was writing on the business ethics and the issues with accountants falsifying, falsifying accounts and things like that. They called it creating values. And I'll bet you they believed it. I'll bet you they believed it. Right? So I think it's not often that we do things just defiantly, this is wrong, I'm going to do it, I don't care. Of course it happens, but not that frequently. We humans are rational animals, to be sure, but also intensely rationalizing. We are always ready to feed ourselves some line and convince ourselves that what is wrong is right, or at least all right. Right? So always ready to, so this tendency to explain things away. Perhaps more than anyone, this philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, born 1833, we've already got the introduction, 1833 to 1813 to 1855, and father of existentialism, wrote a lot about moral and religious psychology, but he more than anyone, I think, addresses this issue and very poignantly. For Kierkegaard and for Immanuel Kant, who he studied very closely, we all know what we need to know to lead ethical lives. We don't need more knowledge. Knowledge about right and wrong is equally distributed. There's no such thing as being ethically gifted in the sense that you might say be gifted with numbers or a gifted writer. So there's no ethical geniuses. No, for Kierkegaard, we all have the knowledge, the moral knowledge that we need. And the real task is to hold on to that knowledge. Now, what could get in the way of it? Well, the fact that knowledge is often going to lead to sacrifices, and it's going to bring us into a collision with our self-interest. Right? Oftentimes, despite what we'd like to think, doing the right thing is going to be painful and can lead to great sacrifices. Right? Kierkegaard writes, and this is, and we'll see this quote again. Listen up, exegesis time. This is how the great majority of men live. They work gradually at eclipsing their ethical and ethical-religious comprehension, which would lead them into decisions and conclusions that their lower nature does not much care for. Right? So he thinks that as we expand our knowledge in one direction, our ethical vision shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. It's the old idea of as you get older, you get less idealistic almost. Right? In the same text, he exhorts us to do the good that we would do now, because conscience often leads us into a collision with our immediate self-interest. And the longer we put off acting, the more likely it is that we will talk ourselves out of what we know. Now, so this idea that you obscure, that one of the ways we do wrong is by obscuring something we knowledge that we have, obscuring our conscience. A couple of examples here. In the 80s, when I began studying Kierkegaard, I was up for a Fulbright to go to Denmark, and I needed to go to Denmark to learn the language and read the text in the original and that kind of thing. At the same time, I had a friend who was in Nicaragua in the mountains working as a midwife. And she was sending reports back to me that the Contras who we were supporting were coming in, killing the doctors, the midwives all the time, right? So committing murder up there. And I really trusted her. She was a fellow student and never given to hyperbole, and so really trustworthy. I decided I can't pay taxes anymore. I'm going to tax resist. Right? I don't want to support these murderers. And they were killing them just so the Sandinistas wouldn't be popular. So, okay, but then someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, well, Gordon, you're a finalist for the Fulbright, and I don't think that tax resisting is going to go over too big with a Fulbright committee. Oh, I said, well, maybe I better think about this. A few weeks later, I said, well, the usual one, I can do more good if I get my PhD, and blah, 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 and off to Denmark I went. Right? So that would be the kind of self-obscurification process Kierkegaard's talking about. Or another example, when I began as a boxing trainer, you have to get certified. And so a certification procedure took place years ago, and one day before this big tournament. And so we all got called into a room, and they were going to give us this test for certification. So we all sit down, and the guy says, oh, don't worry, everyone's going to pass the test. And I'm like, okay, I like that kind of a test. And he said, well, I'm going to give it to you orally. There's 75 questions. He's going to give you this multiple choice exam orally. So he'd say, after a fight, do you give the boxer, a boxer's been knocked out, do you give him aspirin? Is that right? A, aspirin, B, C, do nothing, D. I mean, like A, B, C, like, oh, I got the idea, right? It's a very tightly knit group of experienced coaches. And so after about 3 or 4 questions, I'm thinking, I got to say something. And then I realized, I say something now, I'm out of this group, my kids aren't going to be able to box, all right? And the guy sitting next to me was my mentor, a Marine colonel who taught me a lot of what I know about teaching and dealing with kids. And I'm thinking, well, if this guy's not saying anything, And so we went through with it, And the things I told myself is, we all know what we're doing. This is a silly test, right? All kinds of rationale, But again, I think the rubber hits the road very quickly sometimes in life. All of a sudden, you're in that situation. Now, here's 2 situations where I think I did the wrong thing. I think I did the wrong thing. But it wasn't just like, oh, this is wrong, I'm not going to do it. I had explanations for it. Okay. Now I'd like to take a look at this quote if I can get this computer working. I had this thing working. Okay, I think I'm going to go back. Okay, get your thinking caps on. Close reading time. Okay. So let's look at this quote from The Sickness and Death, 1849 it was published in. And if you could read one book by Kierkegaard, I would highly recommend this one. This one is on his analysis of despair and its relationship to selfhood and to becoming a spirit. And this is from the second part of it. He writes, so, if a person does not do what is right at the very second he knows it, then first of all, knowing simmers down. And next comes the question of how willing appraises what is known. If willing does not agree with what is known, then it does not necessarily follow that willingness goes ahead and does the opposite of what knowing understood. Presumably such opposites are rare, right? The kind of case of defiance. Rather, willing allows some time to elapse, an interim called, we shall look at it tomorrow. That's the beginning of the slippery slope. We shall look at it tomorrow, right? During all this, knowing becomes more and more obscure, and the lower nature gains the upper hand more and more. The lower nature's power lies in stretching things out. So you see this element of time and self-deceit. Gradually, willing's objection to this development lessens. It almost appears to be in collusion. And when knowing has become duly obscured, knowing and willing can better understand each other. Eventually, they agree completely, for now knowing has come over to the other side of willing. It admits that what it wants is absolutely right. Alas, for the good must be done immediately, as soon as it is known. And this is how perhaps the great majority, we had this quote before, but men lived, they worked gradually at eclipsing their ethical and religious comprehension, which would lead them out into decisions and conclusions that their lower nature does not much care for. And again, I think, so you can see that, so I think this is a very astute analysis of self-deception. A couple of comments on it. So he's not saying that we should do whatever we want to do impulsively. It's only after you know what the right thing to do is that you should do it and not waste any time, right? So it's not as though he's saying we should just impulsively do things. The fair question could be, well, how do I know when I know, right? And that's true. And this is where we shall look at it tomorrow can often come in the door, right? This is where the procrastination can start, and the doubts that are really an attempt to talk yourself out of knowledge. So yeah, that's definitely a problem, but I think in many, many cases we do know what the right thing is. We have a certain kind of clarity. So what else about this passage? Another thing that strikes me is the dialogue between knowing and willing, this lower and this idea of a higher and lower nature, right? The kind of thing you find in Plato, Bible, Aristotle, Augustine, and this whole metaphor of an internal dialogue, which is so much a part of what it is to be human, right? And I wonder about what the metaphors we have for the self today, often coming from neuroscience and computer science. I wonder if those metaphors can accommodate this kind of reality, whether or not they really pick this kind of internal discussion up, whether the metaphors we have today can really accommodate this kind of an insight. Also, again, in this issue of time, the role that time plays in the dialogue between conscience and the will. We shall look at it tomorrow, a great phrase. I see procrastination all the time with my students writing papers, and here's a moral dimension to it. Right? I even have a procrastinators club with my philosophy class. So the connection between procrastination and moral self-obscurification, I think he's getting at, which is... And finally, this notion, another insight I think here is, in this text, in this part of the text, Kierkegaard is wondering whether or not he's trying to define evil or sin, and the suggestion from Socrates was that sin is ignorance, right? Sin is ignorance. Well, Kierkegaard argues that if you're ignorant of something, you can't be culpable for it, right? But yet he says there is a degree of culpability in ignorance, in sin, because it's an ignorance that we ourselves produce. It's a self-produced ignorance, right? So it isn't the kind of ignorance that we're innocent of. It's one we produce to get out of having to do something that's going to involve a sacrifice. Okay. A good example of this kind of dialogue occurred with a friend of mine. After the earthquake in Haiti, he lives in, this man lives in Florida, has a big house. He called me up and said, I've got to do something. I want to take refugees in. It's ridiculous. I have this big house to myself. There's plenty of room for other people. But he's a very private individual, kind of anxious, not easy, doesn't find it easy to be around people. He decided to think about it for a few days. After a few days, well, I'm not going to be much good to anybody if I'm a mess. Who knows? Well, these people are going to have to find housing anyhow, and the next thing you know was adios to the idea of having refugees in the house. So that's the kind of process that Kierkegaard is trying to illuminate. Okay, self-deception is not only a major issue in the way we act. So it's not only with actions, it's also, would argue that it involves our belief formation. You recall Aesop's fable about the fox and the grapes, right? The fox is thirsty and sees these grapes up over a stream, jump up a bunch of times to try to get them, can't reach them. He walks away and in his little fox language says, the grapes are sour anyhow, right? That's an example of how self-deception, the belief formation there. Okay, and this is from Samuel Butler. And, let me see that. Okay, this is from and it also infects our view of ourselves. Self-deception does. This is what Samuel Butler writes. There is not anything relating to men and characters more surprising and accountable than this partiality to themselves, which is observable in many, as there is nothing of more melancholy reflection respecting morality, virtue, and religion. Hence it is that many men seem perfect strangers to their own characters, right? They just seem perfect strangers, strangers to yourself. They think and reason and judge quite differently upon any matter relating to themselves from what they do in cases of others where they are not interested. Hence, one hears people exposing follies which they themselves are eminent for, and talking with great severity against particular vices, which if all the world be not mistaken, they themselves are notoriously guilty of. This self-ignorance and self-partiality may be in different degrees. This likewise was the reason why the precept, know thyself, Socrates' precept, the Greek precept, was so frequently inculcated by the philosophers of old. For if it was not for that partial and fond regard to ourselves, it would certainly be no great difficulty to know our own character, what passes within this bent and bias of our mind. Much less would there be any difficulty in judging rightly of our own actions. So the idea would be that the dictum, know thyself, wouldn't have to be repeated so frequently if it weren't so hard, right? But I also want to argue that this self-deception gets involved in our political views and such. For example, the other day I was driving along and I saw this Obama bumper sticker, right? The traditional insignia. I'm a fan of Obama, so I was like, oh, cool. And then underneath it says, can I please see your birth certificate? Can I please see your birth certificate? Now, I would suggest that, I don't think maybe I'm crazy, but I don't think this person really believes that Obama doesn't have a U.S. birth certificate. I mean, it's one thing to be against him and his policies or whatever, but you don't need to invent fables, right? These crazy lies to support your belief. But then again, the psychologist Leon Festinger, cognitive psychologist, suggests that maybe we do need to do just that. In the late 70s, Festinger came up with his theory of cognitive dissonance. People have heard of it before? Right? Okay. And the idea is that when you have two conflicting beliefs, you're going to be in a drive state in which you need to change one of those beliefs, right? And you will change it, right? And the stronger the belief you have, the stronger belief will dictate which belief is going to be changed. Now, the way when you're in this conflict of different beliefs, you're motivated, you're in a state of anxiety and a drive state to alter one of your convictions. And now, one of the things he looked at when he came up with this theory was a case in 1956. They followed these people in a UFO cult who were convinced they were going to be taken up in spaceships on a certain day, right? And he wanted to see what would happen when they weren't taken up, right? He wanted to see what would happen, how would they deal with it. And you'd expect that so he's sitting there with his pen and paper, this big group, and watching the hour, and records what's going on. And you'd think that when it didn't come down, the group would have disbanded, or they would have found that argument against her, that to show that they were wrong. But no, right after that, they redoubled their efforts at recruiting people, right? Because of the cognitive dissonance. They redoubled their efforts at recruiting people, at making claims about the spaceships and that kind of thing. So just the opposite of what you'd intuit. So this difficulty in coping with beliefs that conflict with our own, or our tendency to alter them. This summer I wrote an op-ed that I called the compassion deficit. In the article I more or less sighed, this is another example of cognitive dissonance. In the article I more or less sighed that it was appalling that Americans were not appalled by our 30 million plus people who can't go to the doctor without being afraid of going into bankruptcy. My point was that if you're not in favor of the president's health care reform, then at least you should feel an urgency about coming up with something else, right? You'd say, okay, President Obama, you're wrong about this, but we have to do something. We just can't live in a country where all these people can't go to the doctor, right? I added that while Americans may have a right to think of themselves as, we Americans, as brave, energetic, and everything else, we should cross out compassionate. We're not a compassionate people. Well, this assertion hit the jackpot for comments. I received hundreds and hundreds of comments, and that was the one that was like, and it was here it was clear that I was presenting a claim to the effect that that would cause a certain amount of dissonance. These people thought of themselves as kind, compassionate, and here I was saying, no, you aren't, right? And so people would write things like, I don't lack compassion. We already have a universal health care system. All you have to do is to go to the emergency room. And do you think people really believe that? I mean, they stabilize you in the emergency room, right? Like if you have a serious, right? Or again, these are, I don't lack compassion. These are irresponsible bums. And I don't think that I should have to pay their medical bills, right? So again, another way of dealing with cognitive dissonance, right? This falsifying things. Now this is a bit of an aside, but I'm of the opinion that a healthy democracy requires that its citizens have a capacity to deal with a little bit of cognitive dissonance, to be able to tolerate different views. Otherwise, there's no changing of opinions, no real exchange of ideas. And I think we're in bad shape these days with this, in regard to this, because of the triumph of pure advocacy journalism, right? It used to be that if you had now when you're confronted with a view that might trouble you a little bit or seem a little bit dissonant, all people have to do is turn on their TV channel on the right or the left, and it explains away the dissonance. So there isn't a real time of, and I think it really gets in our way of reflection and discourse, right? So, you know, one person hears one thing and turn on Fox News and, oh, got that taken care of. Or turn on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, and got that taken care of, right? So I think cognitive dissonance is really, the ability to tolerate that is important. Okay, almost okay for time? So again, we need to keep an eye out for self-deceit in our beliefs. As the philosopher Jonathan Glover has written, we have a duty to look with special care at our grounds for holding factual beliefs that are suspiciously convenient to us. We have a duty to look, so these beliefs that are very dear to us, we need to keep a third eye on what our grounds for that are and how we respond to views that conflict with these beliefs, right? So it's, now, one of the humble points of this philosophical sermonette has been simply that when it comes to ethics education, we need to make room for some discussion of self-deception. Right? Again, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Butler, and others would be great for this, great to put in the curriculum. But last week I gave a talk on self-deception to my class, and one earnest young man raised up his hand and said, well, Doc, okay, I see what your point, but let's be practical. How do we avoid this? And to this, I would say that a little self-awareness goes a long way, right? An awareness, for example, of the level of intensity of our beliefs, the level of intensity that can cause us to filter opposing views in the wrong way. And this might sound a little hokey, but I also think that it's helpful to have a little self-awareness about one's background and emotional makeup. Awareness of your background and emotional makeup. This is a Freudian twist on the Socratic dictum of know thyself. That it's good to know what your emotions are. For instance, in discussions about healthcare, the healthcare debate, there were many people I talked with who seemed they would go just bonkers about the idea that someone was going to get something for nothing. All right? Irrationally angry, just drove them crazy. Right? They were nice people, but the idea that someone was going to, their thought was like that you might get a break on your health care and still get premium channels on your TV set made him apoplectic, right? Apoplectic, you know. And if I was one of those folks, I would at least like to be able to acknowledge to myself that there's something inside, anger, fears of being cheated, that make me irrationally upset about someone getting off with something they didn't have to work or sacrifice for. Oddly enough, most of these people weren't upset about people with trust funds, inheritance, because there they said, well, grandpa did the work, but the idea that said they could be cheated, right? It was that someone was going to get over. And then maybe I need to keep an eye on the extent to which I let that issue color my views on public policy. And we all have demons like that. We all have stuff like that. After all, if there are 3 people out of 100 who would cheat the healthcare system, would I rather the other 97 be deprived of healthcare than to let these 3 people get over? Of course not. I don't think, right? So, okay. Though the human capacity for self-deception may know no bounds, it's helpful to try and be honest about our own emotions and self-interests, to try to be clear about them. Strangely enough, honesty of this sort may require being non-judgmental enough with ourselves to acknowledge feelings that may not be that pretty, right? Suppose you grew up for example, this issue of the deficit. I suppose if you grew up in a house room which people were completely freaked out about going over about spending money and that kind of thing, could really affect the way you see things. So our background and our emotional makeup can really decide what accent is put on what issue, and it's good to be aware of that. For example, I grew up in an Italian background, and like the worst thing in the world to do if you're Italian is like, and my family was, if you're a cheapskate, better to be a murderer. Better to be a murderer. Like they'll say, a bad guy is someone, he never picks up a check. He never picks up a check, like, God forbid, right? Like, okay, you know. And so part of me is predisposed. I go, who picked up the check? Who you know, that kind of stuff. So just an awareness of these kind of currents, are psychological currents in our background, I think are really important. Okay? It is as one moral sojourner to another that I suggest that the struggle for anyone who's intent upon walking the moral line is primarily one of keeping clear about your convictions, even when these convictions might well mean that your bottom line of pleasure and fulfillment is not as high as it might have been if you've been able to talk yourself out of your moral common sense. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Dr. Burrow.
You've given us information, but you haven't told us a whole lot about how do we fix any of this?
How what?
How do we fix it? How do we change things? Politicians listen to one thing, that they don't get elected. Mm-hmm. And the topic here, and if you look at amongst our group today, you probably will see very few politicians here.
Right. Right.
And they're frequently here.
So how have we changed political?
How do we change this world we live in to actually represent the ethical situation you present to us today?
Well, as I said, I think people need to be more. I think people need to be more self-aware of their interests, more able to acknowledge them, right? And that takes some work. That takes some psychological education. That really requires. I think some of that takes place by encouraging people to talk about self-deception. That's one of the things I'm planning.
Dr. Marino, could you use the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
That's
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm talking here about ethics education. We learned a lot about moral theories and that kind of thing, but not a great deal about the things that get in the way of doing the right thing. And people don't have a lot of chances to discuss issues like self-deception. So, but I think certain environments are really important, right? I mean, where you can be honest about what you're feeling. And I don't have any global solution for it, my friend. Yeah. How to get politicians, that's another. Yeah.
Bob, right there.
Thanks.
You talked about Kierkegaard and saying that you didn't use the word conscience, but the conscience is a higher function, and it seems like then the thinking about it afterwards is a lower function. Well, it seems like he's saying that the intellect has serious limitations, and that there's something more than the intellect going on when the conscience is enacted, whereas once you turn it over completely to the intellect, it will decide anything.
Either that, yeah, that's a good point. Now, there he has the word conscious in Danish, and he doesn't use it there in this particular passage, which is interesting. Talks about knowledge. So, but the idea is that the lower appetites or desires, our self-interests, are beneath the will, and the will pulls knowledge down, and over time, Yeah, that it can't stand on its own to some extent, right? And you get that same kind of image with Plato, right? You have the human being as pictured as a chariot, reason's a charioteer. You have thumos and spirit and appetite, right? And if the self's out of balance, the intellect doesn't drive it. But yeah, there's a certain vulnerability of knowledge, intellect, for Kierkegaard, knowledge, to being dissuaded. Yeah.
Right here.
As I recall the sequence, in the 60s, there was a great resurgence of interest in Kierkegaard, but
Yeah.
shortly after, the debates on situational ethics came along. I think the war in Vietnam had something to do with that. We have very few cut and dried, black and white global issues today. Where do you see situational ethics fitting into how we perhaps deceive ourselves and how we come to moral judgments?
Yeah, there's not that much, at least in my experience, in ethics these days, and I've just written a textbook, there's not a lot of talk about situational ethics in America. So quite a bit in Europe, but not here. And with the idea, the claim would be that it's relativism, right? And not an adequate theory, not an adequate way of dealing with ethical problems. So that's where things are, I think, with situation ethics. But yeah. Of situation ethics to work to issues in development? Yeah, I think it probably would be, yeah. Yeah, I'm certainly open to that, yeah. Thanks, good question.
In the back. Alex.
Thank you, Dr. Marino, for coming today. I appreciate your talk. I guess as you were talking, a question that was kicking around in my head was, what would Kierkegaard say regarding benefits, good things, virtues that come out of bad decisions, out of bad decisions, that someone is making a very self-centered, selfish decision, weighing the willing versus the virtue, and over time deciding in the quote-unquote kind of bad direction. But perhaps there are many examples throughout history where very positive things have kind of risen out of that. And would Kierkegaard say that was an exception that proves the rule? Would he suggest that that was more of a universal divine intervention at that point? Or is there some merit to, we make decisions, maybe they're self-serving, but some really great things that serve many people can rise out of that?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, evil actions could have good consequences, mistakenly, right? But I don't think when he's talking about morality, he wouldn't be looking to the consequences to assess them, right? So in that sense, he's a Kantian. For Kant, it's only you only have control of your will, you don't have control over consequences, so we don't judge our actions in terms of the consequences. And he's talking about individual morality here, so the question of whether or not something good could come out of it would be, yeah, something good could come out if you repented, if you acknowledged, that was messed up what I did, right? But if you don't do that, if you just keep going down there, so repentance there, a sense of guilt, which we don't see much of today, right? How many people in the banking scandal have said, yeah, man, that was terrible what I did? Nobody, I don't think, right? I think, but so I think repentance of some sort would be important from there. Thank you for the question.
Right there.
The question was asked a second ago about what we can do to change this. How we can raise ethical standards short of throwing the bums out, which is always every 4 years or 2 years.
So the question is, how do we raise the ethical standards of politicians? Why don't you ask Jesse that one, man? What'd Jesse say about that? What'd Jesse Ventura say about that?
It strikes me that the answer might be found in a parable that Kierkegaard actually wrote about. The two jewel thieves breaking into a jewelry store, but they didn't steal anything. They just switched all the tags on everything. And the idea being that some people came weeks later and got great bargains, and some people got fleeced. And the idea being that today we still don't do a very good job of understanding what's of true value as what is not. And maybe if we could decide as individuals and as a group what really mattered, then maybe we would quit getting fleeced so often.
Yeah. But don't you think the media has something to do with that too? I mean, people get their views from the media. If the media is pushing stories about, I don't know, what, Sarah Palin or something like that, stories that aren't, how are you supposed to make your judgments? So I think the media is very important in that regard.
Back there, Bob. Yep, right there. No.
I'd like to get back for a second to this concept of the limitation of the intellect. You said fairly early on that we are both rational beings and irrational beings.
Rationalizing.
I would maintain that we're irrational beings who aspire to rational
It
behavior.
could be, okay.
And there are two instances of recent psychology research that I would like to hear your comments on and maybe put them in a Kierkegaardian perspective. One is from some neuroimaging studies that show that we actually make decisions 5 seconds before we know we do. So there's some subconscious element to something we think of as being the most conscious thing that we engage in. And the other is a study showing that that being forced to use one's rational capacities to the extent of something as small as remembering a 7-digit number removes our ability to make good choices. And in this case, it was choices about healthy food selections for lunch or something. And so, it seems like we have very, very limited powers of rational thought and that they can be distracted and destroyed by the most minuscule distractions. And that, this kind of fascination in the media with trivialities and lots of other sorts of problems that you've addressed today sort of come down to this misconception, this self-deception that we are rational beings, when in fact we're primarily emotional beings who respond with, evolutionarily and intracted types of behavior.
So we shouldn't trust so much in our intellect. We should be wary of our intellect.
We should at least try to take that into account, I think, in the way that decisions are brokered.
So a sense of humility about the power of our reason. I would agree. Now, my wife's here. Sue, where's Sue? She's a neuroscientist. She's very critical of some of these mental imaging studies. So do you want to? Okay. So she says we shouldn't treat those mental imaging studies as the gospel. Is that? What'd you say? Yeah.
Right, ideas come into unconsciously come into our decisions.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Both of you. Thanks so much.
I had a thought when you first started, about 12, 15, and that was the hardest thing to do is to remove yourself from the equation to weigh a matter fairly. How would you apply that thought to everything that's been asked here?
To remove yourself from equation?
To remove yourself from the equation to weigh a matter fairly.
Well, that's what I was saying, that I think we have to encourage a self-awareness about our interests and for people to be honest about them and not feel bad about them, right? For example, whenever I hear a politician running for office, it's, I'm running for office to save the country or this or that, right? All the time, people will rarely, and even in academia, will rarely say that they're doing, well, I'm doing this for the college or I'm doing this for, so being a little bit more, not having to have this pretense of always acting altruistically to create a culture in which we can acknowledge our feelings like that, those interests. That seems to me to be essential, to not have to lie about it, and so to encourage our students not to feel badly if to acknowledge their self-interest. So again, I think a lot of psychology is important here. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
Right here.
Thank you. I am the daughter of a naval officer and the mother of an Army colonel. I am from the quote unquote do nothing generation. And I have found myself as the mother of a warrior to be in great conflict with political decisions. Political decision making has become very difficult for me, and I can assure you that what will out for most mothers, or at least this mother, that's all I can speak to, of course, is the welfare of my child. It will override every other reasonable argument.
Right. Right. I don't know what you, but I have 2 children. I mean, it's pretty primal. It's pretty primal, and yeah. And so you're saying that all your decisions are based upon what's good for your children?
No, I am saying that political decision making is likely to determine what I perceive as in my child's best interest.
How about other children?
At the time of the thinking, there are no other children.
Yeah.
And now I can speak beyond
Right.
that and do have great empathy and understanding and compassion for those who suffer and care with.
Right.
But the primal need is overlaid with everything else that
Okay, yeah, I understand, yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Marino. She's still talking. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
Very early in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis talks about an absolute good, an absolute morality that exists independent of ourselves. And when I saw the first slide and your discussion of the knowing, of us already being aware of what's right and what's wrong, do you think that lends itself to belief in a Christian God? I mean, or is it even necessary to believe in some spiritual entity for that to even be accepted?
The Kierkegaardian type view?
Just in general, I mean, to accept the concept that there's this knowing, that we already know what's right and wrong, doesn't there have to be an independent force similar or analogous to what C.S. Lewis was called an absolute morality?
Right, right.
I mean, do you think that's necessary?
I'm not sure, but I think anyone who believes that we're all endowed with a conscience. Now, whether or not you can believe in conscience without believing in God is another question, right? And what part that plays. I mean, so I think it's certainly conceivable.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not trying to back you in a corner, but at least as from like an independent perspective, doesn't it have to be independent of ourselves for something like that to exist?
I'm sorry, what would need to be independent?
You're referring to it as conscience, but doesn't it have to be an independent spirit or force or entity of some sort for something like that to be tugging on us in one direction or another?
Right, yeah, well, so Kierkegaard certainly thought there was, as you're well aware. Yeah, now whether people like Peter Singer who would think that we have that within us in reason, right? Reason gives us access to these kinds of truths.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good question. Yeah.
You have time for two more. We'll start right here. Yeah.
I would perhaps make the argument that our current consumer culture encourages self-deception, since we're so
You think?
I guess
Get out
specifically in this case, because we're so disconnected both from the process and the source of where our goods and services come from. And we have to put forth a huge amount of time and energy to actually figure out if our goods and services are produced in a moral way, you know, and since they're, you know, it's trade between nations, you know, thousands of miles apart. Do you think there is a way to overcome self-deception in a global economy in which we have a very hard time of actually knowing? And we have very little interest in knowing.
I'm a boxing trainer. How would I know? No, I certainly agree with you about consumer culture and the tendency towards self-deception. But I'm not sure about how that would be cured in a global culture where so much marketing depends upon falsity, too, right? False claims. We not only have to find out where the products are coming from, but even if the claims that they're making about them are true, right? But good insight. Yeah.
Patrick.
Hello, my name is Patrick Banks. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Last semester in our law and ethics course, and just a little bit this semester in our professionalism course, we talked about the validity of nonprofits as a third sector in our society. And the conversation went something along the lines of, you know, the public sector, government, moves a little too slowly to solve problems.
Right.
And the private sector only tries to solve problems if it's financially driven.
Right, yep.
And so, you know, nonprofits play this role as sort of a Band-Aid that fills the crack between those two.
Great way to think about it.
What would Kierkegaard say about nonprofits? Would they be a valid third sector or something else?
Okay. What would Kierkegaard say? I often get that question in my position. He didn't, he thought so much about individual morality that he didn't think a great deal about proper structure of community. And he certainly thought self-sacrifice, taking care of your neighbor was very, very important, right? And that we ought not to do that out of self-interest. He was very concerned about the extent to which those things are driven by self-interest sometimes. But he wasn't good. He didn't. He thought that he was so concerned with kind of the community or everything taking over the individual that he really stands on behalf of the individual against the social order in some way. So he didn't give a lot of his thought to that kind of question. But I like the way he put it about the nonprofits, the gap they filled there and all. But so I don't know what he'd say about that. I'll have to talk to him later. I'll channel him later.